All right. So, Socrates, I'm wondering if you agree with Donnie's definition of Zionism. He self-describes himself as a Zionist. What does Zionism mean to you?
Yes, so Noam Chomsky said that in the early days of Zionism, there were the camps that were wanted a very inclusive idea of Israel that had Palestinians and Israelis as neighbors in a very kind of neighborly, egalitarian way, and there were more exclusionary ideas of Zionism, and that for him those were both Zionism, and today those have been turned into kind of Zionism and anti-Zionism. Um, so I'm someone who thinks that ultimately, for there to be peace, there needs to be a Palestinian state in which Palestinians can be safe and have autonomy and dignity. Um, that's kind of generally where I'm coming from. I'm someone who thinks, yeah, also there, a two-state solution is probably the best way forward, and that um, justice is probably a prerequisite for peace and not the other way around. But we can get into that, obviously.
My my question specifically about Zionism.
Hmm.
So I know that Zionism is a heated,
Hmm.
debated term these days. Some people
Absolutely.
hear Zionism and they think that it is referring to people who just want to take over as much land as they can. A lot of
Hmm.
people think that Zionism is inherently expulsionary of Palestinians. I think when Donnie describes himself as a Zionist, it doesn't mean that to him. It means something more along the lines of wanting the Jews to have a home. So, Socrates, my question to you is what is Zionism? Is it a good term? When Donnie describes himself as Zionist, like is that a fair description? What does that mean to you? What does Zionism or Zionist mean to you?
I mean, it's one of those terms that gets uh, so twisted around in public discourse that it's kind of like you can tell maybe a lot by somebody by how they use the word, what they use it to mean. For some people, it's a slur. For some people, it's um, like a political ideology or a spiritual
What is
ideology.
it to
Or
you? What is it to you?
to me, it's just the recognition that it can mean all those different things in
So
the
you
different
don't hear,
contexts.
and then I'll move to the next point, but you don't hear Donnie describe himself as Zionist and think, what an evil person. Like you don't have a problem with someone self-describing as Zionist. You don't think that that necessarily means disrespect to Palestinians. You think there's right?
I think in general that the term says very little.
Okay,
It says that
cool.
you're roughly maybe more on one side of something, but somebody might even say, "I call myself a Zionist because I want to reclaim the term as being something that's critical of Israel." Right? It could mean almost anything.
Okay, so that's got it. So Socrates, next question. What are Israel's intentions with the war right now?
I think this is a complicated question. I think every state has multiple different undercurrents and things that it's trying to do, and different moving parts within government and ideologies, and there's um, different factions within the Knesset that are pushing for different things. um, there's obviously different things in play. There's people who want to keep their citizens safe, and so they feel like they need to put in some kind of show of force against violence toward their own people. There are certainly ministers within the Israeli government who have said um, either kind of genocidal or ethnic cleansing things within speeches after October 7th. There's and you'll find within Israeli society people who want to live as neighborly equals with Palestinians, and you'll find people who are very racist within Israel. I mean, it's a nation.
So let me just open the floor to you guys. I'm trying to identify points of disagreement between you guys.
Well, actually, I can jump
Where
in
do
with a
you think
point
you
of
guys
this.
disagrees?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you
I
sound
was
good.
going to say I can rewind to the last point to find a small point of disagreement
Hmm.
is where I agree with Sock that that Zionism can mean many things. I think taking such a fluid definition as to sort of like say that there's no center of gravity around Zionism kind of gives a free pass to people to be vehemently anti-Zionistic, um, in a way that if Zionism were to be defined as just a state for the Jewish people with a Jewish demographic majority, it would be harder to be super anti-Zionist without skirting closer to anti-Semitism. I still think you can, by the way. I think if you take the definition of Zionism to be a, a state that is democratic and has a Jewish majority, you can still be fully anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. But I do think that when when we give the term full latitude to mean kind of whatever we want, then anyone can sort of have extremely strong anti-Zionist views that to me border on, I don't know, I don't think the intention is anti-Semitism, but as someone who is a really proud Jew and really believes that based off of Jewish history, a Jewish state is vital to Jewish survival, it's hard for me to sometimes hear these opinions and not feel personally under attack. But anyway, yeah.
Mm. Yeah,
Sock, what do you think?
I think I think that's a fair point. When I say it can mean a lot of different things, I just mean when I hear it, when I hear somebody say it either about themselves or about somebody else, I pretty much treat that as zero information gained because I need to know almost everything about what they actually believe to really hone in on what they're actually telling me about themselves or somebody else. Um, I think at a most basic level, you could even say Zionism as there should be some state with Jewish characteristics that is um, a safe place for Jews. Maybe even not necessarily Jewish majority. If there's some way to make a like a pluralistic Israel work, obviously there's issue. I mean, that's a what you're saying about having it. Okay, well, you want every one person, one vote. You want it to stay an Israeli state. To do that, it has to have an Israeli majority and probably not a close majority, but a significant majority. That's a very straightforward, logical situation. Yeah.
So I think that the crux of your guys' fundamental disagreements is something along the lines of how you both interpret the history of Palestine and Israel. I'm going to generalize here, and you guys can correct me. But Donnie, if I had to guess, your interpretation of the history of Israel and Palestine is that Israel has more often been in the right than they've been in the wrong, and that they are not necessarily responsible for Palestinian suffering. And in fact, Israel's the one who's been unfairly treated by the UN and some other surrounding countries. And conversely, Socrates, if I were to try to describe, and you can correct me, your views is that you'd have probably opposite views, right? You probably view Israel as more or less the aggressor over the last 75 years, less willing to make peace than Palestine, and less sincere in their attempts to treat the Palestinians fairly. So that's what I want to get to. I want to understand um, why Socrates you see, to use reductive terms like the Palestinians as the good guys, and Donnie, why you see the Israelis as the good
Yeah,
guys, and
I
where the
would say
differences
that
are.
that is overly
That's the
reductive.
reductive. Okay,
Yeah.
so where do you think that Israel has give me an example, and ideally starting from present day working backwards rather than starting in 1948, like starting either today or yesterday or the day before that or a year before that, as recently as you can. Where do you feel like Israel has treated Palestinians unfairly, whether in peace negotiations or in their general treatment of Palestinians?
Sorry, was that for me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Um, I mean, so looking at the recent, looking at the current conflict that's ongoing, um, I think there's things that I hear dismissed that I think shouldn't be dismissed when it comes to um, Israeli military officials or government officials describing how they're conducting operations. That I've heard pushback of, when you hear people giving speeches or saying things publicly, you shouldn't assume that this says anything about military policy and how things are being conducted. But I think it's hard to, ultimately, when you have a militarily superior nation conducting military operations in a in a population where people are in very dire straits and can't leave even that area, you need to have some good reasons to trust that, given the lack of transparency in how the military operations are being conducted, that there's at least an interest in minimizing civilian casualties, in conducting maximally ethical warfare, to the degree that that's possible, that there isn't the undercurrents of maybe racism or desire for ethnic cleansing among some political groups within the Israeli government, that isn't having a role. So when you have statements of, we're going for maximum destruction with this operation from military officers, when you have ministers in the government saying, we should annex at least northern Gaza, comparing Gazans to biblical figures of Amalek, of the other tribes, back 2,000 years ago, that in the Torah God told the Israelites to kill every man, woman, and children. These are not good things to be referencing when you're trying to project trust about how you're conducting operations, even if it's just trying to signal to your base or to try to do whatever within your society. I think these statements, at least from afar, as an American looking at these feel like something that I can't just kind of brush aside.
Donnie, what do you think?
I certainly don't stand by any of those statements, and I think they're awful. I don't think they characterize the military objectives that the IDF is pursuing in a significant way. I do think, Salk brought up this idea of like this undercurrent of you would say racism, maybe just hatred would be a more generic term that I would feel more comfortable using. And I think that's certainly there. I think a question that I don't have an answer to is, how much does that undercurrent of hatred lead to to immoral war? I mean, there's a whole topic we could get to, is what is a moral war, but kind of the general way that I have looked at the conflict, and maybe this will, or the war in Gaza, maybe this will give us room to continue to find disagreement, is I've looked at, I believe that most other nations, if not any other nation, put in Israel's situation, would conduct the war with similar kind of civilian casualties and with similar amounts of kind of attempts to protect, or lack thereof, to protect civilians. I get to this by just looking at basic, combatant to non-combatant ratios in other conflicts. I get to it by looking at some of the operations Israel's undergone to move civilians around. I get to it by looking at the amount of payload they've dropped and comparing how many civilians have died relative to amount of payload. And seeing that, like, if the goal was to maximally kind of ethnically cleanse Gaza, clearly that's, they'd have to be doing it it would have to be this kind of like behind the curtain, because if they were doing it forwardly, it would I don't even want to like discuss what that would look like, because it would be off. It would have already happened. Everyone would be dead. It would be terrible. So based off of the fact that I basically think Israel's conducting itself like any other nation that has a a government or, I guess, uh, military force next to it that is dedicated to its destruction. Um, I guess that's the lens I see it through, and then sort of stuck trying to reason through how does one go about doing this morally, and maybe if there's no strategic gains, you just stop, even though that's letting your enemy quote unquote win. Like I'm not close to that being the right solution, but or the right moral answer in this specific case.
Donnie, let me qualify your statement like half a degree further, and then Socrates, I want to get your response. So, Donnie, you're saying that in your view, probably other countries would conduct themselves in a similar manner if they were in a similar situation. And by that logic, is it fair to kind of encapsulate what you're saying as Israel is conducting the war in a just way, more or less? Is that fair?
I think that's fair,
Okay,
with the
awesome.
caveat that I think they've become more just over time. I think in the beginning it was worse.
Okay.
Um,
So, Socrates, respond to Donnie's claim that Israel is conducting the war in a just way.
So there's I'm trying to think of where to start with this because I feel like
So his and yeah,
a
so
lot of
he's saying that other
yeah.
countries would do the same
No, no,
thing.
no,
They
no,
have to
no.
defend themselves. Yeah.
I got you. I got you. I think a lot of impression of how Israel is conducting these operations. I'm not 100% convinced that war is actually the correct term for what's going on, because the war is between two sovereign nations, and there is no Palestinian state. This is a region, and Hamas is considered a terrorist group. So it's I think the boundaries of how we define this can get a little messy and a little complicated. But in the most general sense, how they're conducting this operation, I think a lot of the impression of that is probably down to sets of individual kind of facts that we see, and whether we see headlines of, oh, Israel is doing this good thing and providing humanitarian zones, or oh, Israel just bombed this humanitarian zone that they asked people to move into, and which one of those kind of sticks more and feels more salient. The overall kind of impression or trust that we may have going into this current conflict based on previous impressions of how Israel has conducted itself. Um, so I don't I don't think I have a single individual fact that I can clearly say Israel is conducting this operation, you know, lawfully or unlawfully or morally or immorally. I think I do question the basic premise of Israel is attacked, civilians are murdered, and not just murdered but brutalized. Hostages are taken, um, and then Hamas wants these hostages either to um, prevent retaliation or mitigate retaliation, or as some bargaining for something greater. I don't mean
I can offer a
yeah,
third option,
yeah, please.
which is that they, in fact, want to take the hostages to try to aggravate the war to a place that it wouldn't
Absolutely,
previously have gotten.
exactly.
Um,
Socrates, do you think
Hmm.
that Israel is conducting this, whatever, if you don't want to call it a war, don't call it a
Sure.
war, but why do you think that Donnie thinks that they are conducting themselves in a justified way? It sounds like you don't. So why
Well,
don't you think they're conducting themselves in a justified way?
sure. So I question the basic premise that because a state is attacked, they must respond with whatever proportionate force, whatever that means in context. The general kind of proportion of force between attacks from Palestinians to Israelis versus Israelis to Palestinians is generally extremely disproportionate. I think this is actually on the more proportionate side, um, because so many Israelis were murdered. Um, but I don't, you know, I think it's those kind of statistics are something to look at, but you can get kind of lost in statistics and, you know, oh, you know, 5 people killed, tragedy, 2 people killed, tragedy, you know, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Oh, you know, that's something that happens in war. It's so easy um to forget how much destruction that is. So I think those basic questions of what other options did Israel have, what other diplomatic means may have existed. Um, I question that basic premise that this was the only choice that Israel had, is simply to respond with violence and a kind of all out assault, and the idea that they must destroy this entire not quite government, not quite organization, not quite ideology, some kind of fuzzy mixture of the three, and whether that's plausible, that could be achieved, what it might take in terms of how many Gazans would have to be killed for that to be achieved. I think the idea that they couldn't, that as a nation, that Israel couldn't say, okay, wow, this happened. Let's try to reach out to other neighbors in the region that we have a more normalized relationship. I think what you're saying of Hamas probably propagated this attack in order to stop peace, because the was it the Abraham Accords that was underway that could have undercut Hamas as a power and potentially moved toward some kind of lasting peace. Hamas as an organization probably wants there to be conflict in order for them as a group to persist, and so they wanted to undercut peace.
Here, let,
And
let me
the
zoom in.
idea
Sorry.
that we just have to play into that, and they want violence, so we just have to do violence. I question that basic premise.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
wanna-
I'll jump in to say that I know you want us to find points of disagreement, but like I agree with Sock there. Like I maybe or clearly I'm less critical of the war in Gaza because I well, I'm less critical because while I do think that basically this is probably played into Hamas's hands more than Israel has stood to gain, and everything Sock was saying about Hamas wanting to, or originally we talked about the hostages. I think that was to stoke a bigger response. I think Hamas's goal is um, to destroy Israel, not necessarily in the most sort of genocidal sense. I'm not sure if they really would kill all the Jews. I don't think if they succeeded in kind of having Israel crumble as a governing entity and they were able to get a Palestinian majority and a ruling majority, I think they'd be comfortable with like an Islamic theocracy a la Iran, and the Jews would exist as a minority, just as even today there are some Jews living as a minority in Iran. I mean, it's become breathtakingly small. But so all that being said, yeah, I can look at this and say, you know what, Israel's probably more isolated than ever on the world stage, and um, I can speak of a few probably more tactical rather than strategic. It's hard to say that there's really any strategic victories, at least this far along. I mean, maybe time will tell. The uncovered documents from Hezbollah or Iran, but yeah. So mainly, like, yeah, I think you're right. War probably was losing strategy in this case. But I'm also, I guess, the point of disagreement would be, well, who am I to know though? And I'm not an Israeli sitting there kind of with this military supposed to protect me. This is what states do. They use their militaries to protect themselves. And of course, I want them to do it in a moral way. But I want to pass it back to you. Sorry, Jake.
You don't think, Socrates, that Israel should have protected themselves in the way they did? Let's talk in
Well,
terms of should. I know you're outlining many options that could have happened, and my question is about what should they have done. Donnie acknowledges that maybe what they did, there's better ways for them to have handled themselves, but I think what Donnie's saying is that fundamentally Israel is in the right to have gone after Hamas in Gaza. What do you think they were not in that right? What do you think they should have done, and why should they have not done what they did?
well, I think that conflation that you said of protection with what they've done is the very common through line of Israeli and Palestinian relations, which is some kind of either rocket or other attack from Hamas or other Palestinian groups, and then Israel protects Israeli citizens by going and killing a bunch of Palestinians and creating a lot more radicalized people who, it's hard to get a lot of people willing to at a personal, not even quite citizen, but like individual level, wish to go into another nation and murder a bunch of people when they don't all know a bunch of people who've been killed by bombs from that nation. If that level of violence doesn't exist, it's hard to get people who want to perpetrate that level of violence. So this idea that you can protect your population by making a bunch of orphans on the other side, I think again is something that I would question. And let's not forget that the reason this operation from Hamas was so successful is because so much of the military, instead of being on the Gazan border, defending that border, was defending settlers in the West Bank. And Netanyahu wanting to distract from that, on the Israeli side, is probably a lot of the reason that he launched this operation, because he doesn't want time for his own citizens to examine, well, how did this happen? How did we get here? What's actually going on? There's this guy who's trying to dodge, corruption scandals, trying to stay out of jail and keep being reelected so that he can't be tried. And now there's these huge protests in Israel for people who, after I think it was 6 hostage bodies that were uncovered, there's I don't know, tens of thousands of Israelis that are protesting the government for a ceasefire deal. It seems like there's a leadership change that's needed on both sides, both for
What
this
do you think?
conflict and in general. Yeah.
Is Netanyahu a corrupt guy, Donnie?
I'm not particularly familiar with the cases of corruption against him. I mean, I think those started like 5 years ago with like his son bragging about how his dad could go, pay someone off or something or get some nightclub. Like, I really don't even remember the details. I don't think he's been an effective leader for Israel. I don't think he's looking for peace in the region. I think he's kind of the definition of perpetuating the status quo. I don't know what he personally believes, but I know that he's brought into his governing coalition people who don't believe in two-state solution, who believe in Israeli or Jewish supremacy, rather, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, and want to settle all of the West Bank with Jews and annex it, and want to more even than that. I mean, while I fundamentally want a two-state solution, I could maybe get behind a peaceful resolution where the Palestinians are a minority in Israel. I don't want it. I wouldn't want it in the reverse if the Jews were a minority in a Palestinian state. So I don't think it's really fair to expect the Palestinians to want that. But if it ultimately led to peace and a better life for everyone, okay, fine. But I don't even think that these right wingers, that's what they're looking for. They're looking to eventually have the Palestinians move, leave, feel so isolated and estranged that they don't even live there. So there's just no alignment between their goals and what I can stand behind. And Netanyahu has clearly made, political alliances with them. And so he's a terrible leader. I don't know. Like, again, you want us to find points of disagreement. I can find nits.
It's like
Okay.
we're
Is
not
it
doing it
we'll
live,
edit it.
so
live?
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah.
Yeah, and we don't. Okay, don't worry. I'm gonna make us argue. So
Okay.
one way or another, even if it's you guys against me. So,
Perfect.
Doc, is Israel ethnically cleansing or genociding the Palestinians? Are they doing either of those things?
And so to clarify, are you talking about like long term since 48 whatever, or like right at this moment that's the goal of this operation, or
So I guess there's
which of
four
those are you?
questions.
They go
So yeah,
together obviously, but
present and past, genocide and ethnic cleansing. So there's a quadrant, right?
Mhm.
There's like genocide and ethnic cleansing, before and now. Like when, I guess here's the question: when, if ever, has Israel ethnically cleansed or genocided the Palestinians?
Mhm.
There's the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think ethnic cleansing is much more appropriate than genocide. I don't think
Let's go with that
um
then. Let's go with ethnic cleansing. So when has
yeah.
Israel ethnically cleansed Palestinians?
So I mean, you were saying start with modern, but just as like a very brief from kind of top to bottom. In the early days of the founding of the state of Israel, there were, groups of, I can't remember the precursor to the IDF that was itself basically a terrorist militant group.
Ergun, Palma.
Yeah, was going village to village and marching people, Palestinian village and marching people out. And the combination of direct violence, of threats of violence, and people in other villages hearing about violence and then leaving as a result of that. A huge number of Palestinian villages were emptied. People marched out into the desert, some dying. So that's the Nakba. That's the kind of founding event, and then the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Um, Israel eventually technically leaving Gaza as an occupying force, but still having control over. Um, Danny, it seems like you have a lot of the facts of this at your fingertips. So it's up to five 5 kilometers is the zone into the Mediterranean. 15,
I
10,
don't have these facts.
but
No.
something like that. Of fishing boats can only go so far out. They can't get to the kind of really good fishing channels. So they're kind of controlling their water space, obviously airspace, in Gaza, but not directly occupying inside Gaza until just now with these operations. The West Bank being occupied, and then the um, Oslo Accords with areas, zones A, B, and C. But if you look at those maps, you see, you see why people are comparing the West Bank specifically. I think mostly to apartheid South Africa, where you have these Bantustans that are these kind of small areas that are fully controlled by Palestinians, surrounded by checkpoints and gates and walls. To go from one area within the West Bank to another, you have to go through Israeli military checkpoints and be searched, strip searched. The kind of loss of dignity, the loss of freedom within even the West Bank. So the settlements that are within the West Bank could, be argued to be ethnic cleansing, or the people pushed out of those areas. The settlers who commit acts of vandalism and violence against Palestinians within the West Bank, um, and the outposts that are illegal under Israeli law, that get promoted to settlements that are illegal under international law but legal under Israeli law, that are protected by the military, and the military kind of expands and protects and builds these and bulldozes Palestinians. I think those are reasonable to call ethnic cleansing. Whether the goal of this operation is to do ethnic cleansing, there's obviously ministers who want that. I believe them when they say they want to do that. Whether that's the sum total of what you can say the military like wants or is doing, I think that's very difficult to say. What does a nation want? What does a military want? I think it's always mixed. I think There's no kind of binary way to answer that. Do you look at the proportion of soldiers who want something, proportion of commanders, proportion of individual strikes? I don't know exactly how to answer, a
Yeah.
single thing, this is their goal. But I would say that that sentiment exists, and it's kind of unknown exactly at what level that's being carried out because of the lack of transparency. I would love for the American military to be able to review operations. I understand the IDF not wanting to publish as open source documents. Here's how we conduct all of our operations. That's I think
Yeah.
legitimate to not have that level of transparency. But I would love for some kind of third party to be able to review that, because if it comes down to taking the IDF's word that they're kind of doing this in a lawful and maximally ethical or at a standard of ethics that comports with the international community, I think it's hard to do that. Um,
You said a lot there. Let me try to.
mhm,
I don't mean to be reductive, but I do want to encapsulate like the broader message of what you're saying, and not to neglect any of the details that
mhm,
you shared. So just correct me if I'm wrong. Socrates, your view is that Israel is and has been ethnically cleansing Palestinians,
mhm,
and a big part of that is their unjustified abuse of Palestinian livelihood and rights. Donnie, do you agree with Socrates that Israel is currently and has been ethnically cleansing Palestinians and abusing their rights? Why do you agree or disagree?
Um, I guess with ethnically cleansing, I would say no, but I'm actually not familiar with the definition. So now we're right back
mhm.
to Zionism, where maybe I'm hiding behind the
Yeah.
sliding definition, where I mean, I take ethnic cleansing to be something a little bit more draconian
Mhm,
than what Salk described in the West Bank, which I uh, don't have any, I'm not particularly well versed in that. It's an area I want to learn more about, but I basically agree with his analysis, which is you have the settlers who push outside of, who make these outposts basically on land that is not well defined as to who, you have Palestinians, maybe Israel would say, or they would say, squatting there, but they're not squatting. They've been living there. And so then the whole cycle begins. Briefly, in terms of like the IDF's policy and Israel's policy, as you said, you can't weigh on a society in a whole. But I think a tragedy of this conflict is that a large portion of much more liberal Israelis have basically just turned the other way because they find that they're so, I guess, hardened by the conflict that they no longer feel like they have the bandwidth to care about what the crazy settlers are doing in the West Bank. Um, and in terms of the IDF soldiers who are going and carrying out these operations, you know, having lived in Israel in sixth grade and maintained a lot of friendships with folks who have then end up serving, like I think the 18-year-olds who are just getting assigned to a unit and they're told, you have to go into this house and take these people out of their bed in the night. It's not like they're going in with hate in their eyes. That's the commander told them to do that. So,
mhm,
I do put a lot of blame at these radical settlers who have sort of hijacked a society that is willing to turn a blind eye. And that doesn't give the society a free pass to turn a blind eye to people who are acting terribly, in my view.
mhm.
I hope I don't live to regret my words if I go read up on this and find that this is mischaracterized. But I think sadly that is an accurate read of what's on the ground. You said treating Palestinians unjustly. I mean, yeah, the whole situation in the West Bank's a disaster. So, and I just spoke to that. One area where I guess I would say it was not an ethnic cleansing, even though in certain ways it was, well, it was the Nakba. It was the worst thing that happened to the Palestinians. Was those original expulsions that happened during the War of '48. Um, you brought up, Sock brought up the uh, terrorist groups, basically. I think they were generally, and I could be wrong, um, more terrorist towards the British.
Mhm. Yeah.
Once the actual civil war broke out, um, the the Jewish militias started to consolidate pretty quickly. They turned into the IDF, and at a certain point, the Plan Dalet, like Plan D, went into effect, which was which was exactly what Salk described, which was going into strategic towns and villages and pushing Arabs out to prevent a fifth column from arising and to consolidate and solidify um, a Jewish defensible state, basically, or to create a defensible Israel. At this point, the partition plan had gone into effect. I don't think the British had quite left yet. They were like the last troops were still basically moving out until May 5th of 48. So all that being said, I guess the reason why I'm okay with all of that is because to me it happened within the context of a civil war, and had Israel and IDF not taken those actions, they very well may have lost the war, and there would be no Jewish state today. And there'd be a Palestine, and Jews would be a minority in the state, and the whole tables would have just flipped. I mean, I don't know. I think where the tables wouldn't have flipped is I do think there's a certain amount of, I don't know, the Palestinians have put up with a lot of pain to the point that I would think that they would accept, have accepted, like Arafat, rejected some of these offers. They did look measly compared to a lot of what the Palestinians want, and yet why perpetrate the status quo, which has been so bad for you? So I do think had the Jews lost 48, I think Jews as a minority have kind of given up their pride and honor so many times that they might have just given it up again. And the 600,000 Jews that were living in Israel at the time would have, some would have moved back to America, would have dispersed. The whole infrastructure of the Jewish state would have never been set up. You wouldn't have seen the successive aliyahs of more Jews to the state. So I think it could actually be a quiet region with, like, in all of the Jews that left the various Arab countries. I mean, Palestine would be like Morocco, where you'd have, Morocco probably would have maybe 1 million Jews today if you would, continued that trend line. And so Palestine would be the same way. And I don't know if you'd really see a fighting conflict. Anyway, so that's how I look at those expulsions as justified within that civil war, and that's kind of how I see it. But yeah.
What do you think, Stock?
I think that's a fundamental thread, maybe that we've been able to start pulling at there, which is this question of what's necessary to create a state, or may have been necessary to create a state, and then how do the actions that you take when you think that's the only way to have victory, how does that define your state going forward? I think there's a reason that a lot of people compare Israel and the founding of Israel to the founding of the United States, in that I don't know if anybody makes the argument necessarily that America would have lost the quote-unquote Indian Wars, or that that America would have been unable to spread out west if we hadn't hadn't broken peace treaties, or hadn't ethnically cleansed or genocided indigenous Americans. But I think it's safe to say that the actions that we did take in the founding of America, and the pushing out of ethnic people, or of indigenous people rather, and the actions that Israel took in the expulsion of the people who were living there, colored what kind of nation it became. And whether any whether someone feels like, well, on some kind of net historical effects, whether this is enough towards the things I want that I can stomach the bad things that happened, or whether I would have accepted maybe a failure of the creation of a state in order to not have done these things. I think that's a personal kind of individual thing.
One thing I would say maybe different is that with America, there was never the 20th century framework of diplomacy and understanding of the total amount of land,
Mhm.
where like you had the Native Americans sitting down with the English colonists and being like, okay, here's the Mississippi River. We'll just like divide it along that line
Mhm.
and have a fair amount of faith that that
Mhm.
agreement will hold. There were various treaties with the Native Americans, none of which hold, and ultimately, the settler push just went the whole way.
Mhm.
But I do think it's an unfair comparison to like if we're going to play, which I'm doing very much so, hypothetical history. I do think had the Arab states and the Palestinians accepted the partition plan, I do think there's a good chance we would just have two states next to each other. And so to that end,
Yeah.
while I do fully agree that it's a sort of a personal question of like, do the ends justify the means? The ends certainly don't justify the means. If the Jews had landed en masse in 1950 in a Palestinian autonomous state and just guns a blazing pushed everyone out and
Mhm.
said to hell with it, and then like after the fact I'm like, okay, well maybe we'll split half.
Mhm.
I do think the antecedents matter there. So to me the metaphor holds to a certain point, but not entirely. I want
Yeah.
to sorry I interrupted, but
No. I think that's extremely fair. I mean, the kind of historical contrapositives are unknown because no, certainly no actor within this kind of broader context of this conflict acted in a trusting manner to their neighbors. The Arab states were concerned with an expansionist Israel being formed.
yep.
Um, Israel was concerned about being entirely destroyed by Arab states, and within that distrust, exactly who was right. Were the Arab states that attacked Israel right to fear Israel because they would have done kind of what they ended up doing no matter what, or if they hadn't attacked, then Israel simply just wouldn't have done any of these expansions, either because they wouldn't have had a reason or wouldn't have had an excuse. It's unknown because the Arab states did attack.
So that's actually a viewpoint I haven't heard before, and I'm curious if you could point me just towards. I'd never known that the Arab states were scared that Israel would expand into their boundaries. I don't know if
Yeah,
you can just
let me see
point
if I
me
can
in a
find.
direction of like I'm
Hmm.
curious. Yeah.
Yeah, I read that in there's a chapter in Norman Finkelstein's book Image and Reality of the Palestinian Conflict. I should be able to find it because it's a chapter that's
Okay.
specifically looking at that historical period. Um, but I think it finds like diary entries. So it's looking at some of the diary entries of some of the Arab leaders, and then it's looking at um, probably Ben Gurion writing about, and I know some of those quotes might be disputed, but it seems like there was some impression that certainly it had occurred to early, early
Yeah,
Zionists
I have
pre-Israel,
heard
or
about
kind of
Ben
at that time,
Gurion's diary. Yeah.
um, that there was this issue of, okay, we want to live on this land. There's some people living on this land. It's a problem. How do we resolve it? And I'm sure there were different people who had different ideas of how to resolve it. Obviously, I think there's no disagreement that we both wish that the early Israelis and the uh, Palestinians who were living in those villages that they were expelled from, that they could have formed some kind of community in which nobody would have to be expelled, violence would not have occurred, and yeah, maybe with groups of populations coming in from Russia or from different parts of the world, there would have been enough enough Jews to have a democracy with a lot of Jews, so that it wouldn't have been a kind of demographic issue, or there would have been some provision for
But your
Palestinians
point is that the
living.
Palestinian leaders were scared that Israel would expand and expand and expand, right? That's
Sure, yeah, that's that was the point that I was I can find after we
Yeah, I
find
guess
something
I'll
to
just
give more
jump in to
information on
say,
that. Yeah.
yeah, the maybe factual disagreement that we'll just have to take offline is whether the Arab states were attacking due to a genuine fear that Israel was going to expand, or more to a genuine opposition to a Jewish state. I take the view, my reading of the history is that they were just fundamentally opposed to a Jewish state.
Hmm.
In terms of the Palestinians being scared of Jewish expansion, or ethnic cleansing, or pushing them out of their land, I think all of those things are true. Um, I also think even if you take the most mild form of the Zionist project, um, of implanting millions of Jews, which very well might have happened,
Hmm.
if the Jewish state had been created earlier. 6 million Jews, instead of being killed, would have then ended up in Israel. Um, that's still no easy pill to swallow. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to be a stranger in their own land. So in many ways, I think this two-state, the partition plan was a good thing, independent of the demographic change that was able to happen in mandatory Palestine, precisely because it at least gave the Palestinians some amount of land that they would be autonomous in.
Yeah. And
As
that's the plan that now Palestinians want. It's kind of it's a tragedy of history that, of course, no one wants to give up half of the land that they have, that has just been their land for generations and generations. And of course, where we are right now, with the level of ruination that Palestinians are experiencing, that um, having autonomous control over half of the land of Greater Israel, or whatever, that would be wonderful. It's sad that that played out how it did.
Socrates, how come you think that Arab rejection of a Jewish state was not due inherently to anti-Semitism and resistance to a Jewish state? Why do you think it's not the case that they were resisting a Jewish state, and that you think it is the case that they were rationally scared about continued expansion and expulsion of Palestinians?
So I think this is getting back to what I was saying about, how do we characterize Israel, or the actions of Israel, or the actions of the IDF. I don't think there is just one way that you can characterize
Mm.
a large group of people. I think it was likely a combination of um, probably some level of anti-Semitism, some level of not wanting people they viewed as strangers living in their home, potentially some, concerns about the about the British as their kind of role in this. Um, Maybe some irrational concerns about Jewish expansionism, and maybe some rational concerns. Whether those concerns were rational or irrational is kind of a historical
Yeah.
unknown because of the way things played out. So let's say the Arab states hadn't attacked, and then Israel, attacked these areas anyway. Well, then we would know, but that wasn't how things occurred. So we don't have like a clear historical record of
Yeah.
something
And
different than what happened in history.
And we can move on to the next thing. I guess the one thing I'll point out is that Donnie, it sounds like you believe that fundamentally the Arab leaders rejected Israel out of a rejectionism of a Jewish state, the concept of a Jewish state, whether you call that anti-Semitism or something else. And Socrates, you believe that the reason is because of a rational fear towards expansion. Sounds like neither of you really have data to back it up. Am I right? Or do either of you have
Well,
data to back up what you're
so
saying?
first, I wouldn't reject what Danny's saying. I would say that it's a smaller factor. In my like historical model in my mind of how that played out, it's a smaller factor in my model,
But
and
why? Like
and
what
at
I'm
a
asking, the final question I want to ask in this is like you have different views on this, and I'm
Mhm.
asking both of you why is that your
Well,
view?
so for me, um, if you were to show Arab leaders um, in 1946, the historical record of what has occurred in our timeline with Israel, um, they would perhaps look at, okay, well, we attacked, and maybe we set off these events. If we just accept the partition plan, maybe none of this would have happened. But they also might look at, well, it is a fact that Israel occupied the West Bank, is still occupying, or yeah, occupied Gaza, is still occupying parts of the West Bank, is expanding into the West Bank, occupied Golan, occupied Sinai, and gave Sinai back to Egypt. But it's a fact that they did become a massive military power that kind of is almost overshadowing other countries in the region, is becoming entrenched. I think there could be some legitimate fears there based on what did happen. And so I think looking at what did occur, and also some relational and moral concern about what occurred for Palestinians as a result of, let's say, just the entire history around Israel, not to pin the blame on any specific group, but just simply what did occur for Palestinians. That the chain of events that was set off from the British partition onward until today, just seeing the level of catastrophe that just generally occurred, again, not pointing any specific figures, that they would say, okay, well, something big and bad did result of this. That if it's possible to, if something occurred in history, I think it's plausible to look at that and say, I think they could have some, whether it's illogical or logical, but it's understandable that they could have fears that something like this might happen from our perspective now that it did happen.
Yeah.
I'm
Donnie,
not
do you
sure if
agree with that,
clear
or
the way
is that
the way I
convinced?
said
Are you
that?
Yeah,
convinced,
no,
Donnie, or yeah.
I don't generally agree with that. On a few areas.
Mhm.
I think I want to start with my strongest points first, which
Yeah.
is that drawing a strong distinction between kind of Palestinian Arab leaders and Arab leaders of the
Mhm.
surrounding newly created Arab states. You were saying earlier, Jake, about like, these Arab states decided to reject Israel. Was that due to anti-Semitism? I think it was due to a sense of Arab nationalism, and the idea that this is Arab land and it's kind of impinges on our dignity and honor to, as this Ottoman Empire, which just crumbled and then was kind of became parts of it between Britain and France, were kind of subsumed into other Western powers, and finally, the Arabs were going to rule themselves. But oh, now the Jews are going to like carve up this little part. Like that was an affront. I don't know if I would call that anti-Semitism, but I think you say you talk about evidence. Like I don't have the I'm working from secondary sources
Sorry,
here. I don't have any.
I didn't mean to like take a jab at you when I say you don't have data. I'm just
No,
sorry.
I mean,
Oh no, 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 no! It's
I
good.
think
It's good.
both
Yeah,
of
yeah,
us are.
yeah, but so the kind of the people I'm referencing are from books, really. Daniel Gordis' history, short, concise history of Israel, and again podcasts. And the sense that I get is that from the start of Zionism, as it started to coalesce into a movement that the Arabs really understood, they saw that the para-state of the Yishuv prior to Israel had been set up. They really launched into gear of no, like let's stop this from happening. And I don't think that in Egypt or in Jordan or Lebanon or any of these other countries, Syria, Iraq. I mean, Iraq's far away. Saudi Arabia, like these countries were not worried that their territorial kind of integrity was going to be materially threatened by Israel. But I do think they didn't want there to be this non-Arab state, which perhaps they were scared of their influence. If we're talking in a real politics sense, there for a time there was a pan-Arabist movement, which could have seen some of these states meshing together, and that certainly wasn't going to happen with the Jewish state smack in the middle. So I think there's some realpolitik reasons that the Arab states rejected. On the Palestinian side, I think it's a little bit different. I actually think that to a certain extent they suffered due to kind of being pushed around a little bit by their Arab neighbors. Perhaps they would have accepted a partition plan if it was put to them. I mean, they wouldn't have accepted it happily. Who's happily going to give up half of a land that you had been living in for generations? But at the same time, maybe if they didn't see that there was like, the Jewish state was backed by the United States, well, definitely backed by the British. The United States was a little bit more lukewarm in 48. But, had the premier imperial power backing them, if they didn't have any Arab nations saying, hey, don't accept this, they probably would have just accepted it. So I guess I draw that distinction. And then we go to today and we say, oh, were the fears founded given how much land and territory they lost? I think it's a little bit of chicken and egg in the sense that like it could have been different. So it's hard for me to just say,
Hmm.
oh, the fears were all founded. Well, it's like, you know, I can pause to think of the metaphor, but it's sort of like the kid who's like, so worried that he's not going to be able to fall asleep for his big test tomorrow that he doesn't fall asleep for the big test tomorrow and then say, oh, my fears were founded. I'm not going to fall asleep for the big test and I'm going to get an F. Well, it's like, if you just calm down, anyway, that's
Yeah.
really a bad metaphor, but
No, quick time check, you guys. How much time do you got each have? Like realistically, like
I can go another like
a little bit. I mean,
25
Donnie,
minutes
okay,
easily.
is that fair?
yeah,
Okay.
I have 30 minutes. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
okay. So and I'll try to be a little less like formal and rigid here. Like I'll pretend that we're not recording or anything. So look, I think that there are fundamental points of contention that you guys have, and I don't know why um like so one thing, and I don't want to stick on this point because we have limited time, but regarding the war itself, I mean, Socrates, I know that you think that what Israel is doing is really bad. And Donnie is saying that they're justified in what they're doing.
Mhm.
Donnie is saying that maybe there's a better way they could be conducting themselves, but that ultimately they are justified in what they are doing in Gaza. I don't think that you believe that Israel is justified in what they're doing in Gaza. I'm surprised that you're not more adamant about that.
Who do you want to start answering that?
Yeah, I'm surprised you're not more. I'm surprised that when Donnie says like, yeah, Israel is justified in doing what they're doing, any other country would do this. I'm surprised you didn't more adamantly speak up and say, of course they're not justified in doing that. Like, do you think they're justified in doing what they're doing in Gaza?
No, I don't think they're justified in what they're doing in Gaza.
Okay.
Um, I think there's an issue when you look at it within a narrow historical context. Um, because if you look at it as, this ball of violence being hit back and forth like a ping pong ball, and you say,
Good
well,
analogy.
this guy served it to me, of course I'm going to hit it back. It's a very understandable situation. Um, but to say, is I mean, at a basic level, the idea that when you look historically through, when Palestinians perpetrate some kind of attack towards Israelis, the response, or even, you're talking about all nations. If when when Iran does something to the United States, when Iran hits some U.S. soldiers at a base somewhere, the U.S. kills somebody of Iranian nationality, some military people, some base, something. There's an understood principle in the West that if somebody hits you, you have to hit them back. And you have to hit them back a certain amount that says to your people, we've got you, but doesn't say so much that we're an aggressive rogue nation and we're starting something. That's a common thing that occurs. But I don't think something is justified because it's common. I think the standards for the way Israel is conducting these operations are significantly lower in terms of the protection of civilians than the operating levels of, say, the US in Iraq. I think we had very strict standards, and we had pretty transparent standards of how many civilians might be, at risk from a given strike. I think with Israel, it's hard to say because I'm not even sure what those standards are. I don't know to what degree there's ever been real transparency on how those are conducted. So at the kind of like moment to moment level of how Israel's conducting the war, I think the fact that there isn't transparency itself is a problem. And when I look at how they've conducted past conflicts, the level of violence that they perpetrated, I don't know how much stock you put in things like the Goldstone report, or how familiar you are with
Not
investigations
familiar.
like that. So just to give like a 5-sentence overview. So these were like a UN task force that evaluated. This was in I'm gonna be so far off. It's gonna in the 2000s maybe. Jake, if you want to Google and tell me what decade that was of the conflict. But a UN task force during the conflict to evaluate how Israel was conducting operations, and they concluded that there was systematic, intentional, basically terrorism and violence toward Palestinian civilians in order to break the spirit of Palestinians, in order to degrade, in order to terrify the population. And there's one of the authors of the Goldstone report, Goldstone himself, made a retraction. This was only looking at Palestinian witnesses because the IDF refused to participate.
Can I ask
So
another question?
investigations into Israeli conduct and IDF conduct have in the past concluded that intentional terrorism toward civilians has occurred and has been an operating procedure. And given the lack of transparency here, I think it's hard to say that hasn't happened. There's a lot of different pieces of this. I'm trying to be brief.
Yeah. So what do you think about that, Donnie? Has Israel been doing terrorism?
I definitely don't think that there are cases of like generals being commanded, like coming from a high level strategically, like, okay, we need to rough up this population as much as possible. I think generally what I've read about, like, and I just Googled the Goldstone report. And again, we're getting into. I guess we can do this tactical level. I guess at a higher level, you're not teasing apart so much disagreement from me and Sock, and then I'll go back to answering the question. Just because I think we are just coming at things from like almost different political intuitions. Like Sock is just much more skeptical of the use of force in the international. Like he brought, or they brought up the U.S. As a sort of sub-in for Israel, and I think that's like a very I am understanding of that viewpoint. It's just, I guess I take a more kind of cynical view of the world, and it's hard. So it's a little bit hard to get too much traction. So in terms of the way I see Israeli military conduct, going back to that tactical, I generally think that they have like a set of lawyers who are constantly working pretty hard to try to make sure everything they do is justified, because it's in their interest to be legitimized in the eyes of the world stage. And at various points in different conflicts, they will relax or tighten those rules to balance them to what they feel is the kind of tactical and strategic need. And the strategic need, is there ever a time where you have someone in an Israeli war cabinet think, let's loosen these, not so much because we need to loosen them because our Iron Dome system is going to be overwhelmed, or because we need to like end this war quickly to be able to defend against Hezbollah on the north, but actually because we just want to be punitive against the Palestinian population. If someone's said, do I think that thought has ever gone through a war cabinet's mind? I bet the answer is yes. Do I think that it informs policy? It goes back to the undercurrents of hatred. I mean, it's definitely got to be there. On the whole, and again, this is where it's like were just going to come out in different places. I don't think it's the driving force behind the IDF's tactical approach for two reasons. One, sort of the counterfactual of Israel is a pretty open society in terms of like leaks from their government, from their population. Like I just haven't seen I feel that if there was clear kind of directives coming down saying like, hey, the goal here should just be to destroy this entire neighborhood for the sake of destroying this neighborhood, we'd see more examples of the directives. There was in the 972 mag, there was a big article about something that looked a little bit like this, with their AI system identifying kind of quote unquote terrorists. I'm using quote unquote because I don't think all these people were terrorists. I think someone who is on October 7th killing people is a terrorist. And I think it's hard to figure out, like, was that disproportionate use of force because they wanted to sort of shock and awe and subdue the Palestinian population, or was it because they wanted to quickly subdue Hamas's capabilities? It's hard to say which one was, because very quickly all the rockets stopped coming from Gaza. So it's like I just don't know. It's like you've got to, and I don't have enough confidence to fully say one or the other.
Here's my final question. This ties in all this, and it might be my first question. I didn't get to it. Is Socrates, to what extent did or does Israel contribute to Palestinian suffering in Gaza? I think you guys both agree more or less about the settlements in the West Bank. So I'm talking specifically about Gaza, specifically from 2007. So after Israel left Gaza, 2007, until October 6, 2023. So Socrates, like, to what extent did Israel, through the blockade, etc., contribute directly to Palestinian suffering and resentment from in Gaza from 2007 to 2023, October 6th, vis-a-vis the blockade and etc.?
I mean, blockade, bombings, supporting of Hamas, this is
So
again,
a lot.
this is,
A lot.
I mean, this is
A
going to
lot.
be how
Say a
you
lot. You give
answer
a one.
this, question, how you parse this.
You can well,
I
you
think
say,
they contributed a lot, sure.
a lot.
I
Okay,
can
Donnie, do you
come out
agree or
with
disagree? Now I seem like that YouTube video that you guys sent me. The whole time I'm like that
Um,
guy. I feel like that guy.
yeah, I think they
settle it
contributed a lot.
now.
I think
So
they, yeah.
what do you think, Donnie?
I guess
Socrates
if we're
has a
going
lot.
on a scale from if we're going on a scale from 1 being didn't contribute at all and 10 being primarily responsible, I'd put them at a somewhere between a 4 and a 6. I don't even know.
Where do you
Now I
think
feel like I'm
Socrates
copping out with a
What's
5.
your number?
I think I'm like a 7 or 8.
So I'm gonna go 8 to 4. So why do you think it was the primary reason for their suffering, Socrates? And Donnie, why do you think it was not the primary reason of their suffering? Socrates, why was the bombing and the blockade in 30 seconds? Why was that the primary reason of Palestinian suffering in Gaza between 2007 and October 6, 2023?
I think if the supplies to build a functioning free society, so if the supplies and just the capacity to build just a more at like a resource level, a more functional, more like infrastructure wise, a more functional society were there. So if buildings weren't being bombed, if infrastructure wasn't being bombed, and if the supplies to just build more was there, then Palestinians would have been better off. There would have been not the 40% unemployment rate, not the lack of water, the lack of food. I think that would have been significantly different, drastically different.
Donnie, why don't you agree with that?
I think Hamas controlled the primary levers of improving the Gazans' lives.
Do you think so, Socrates? That Hamas is really the culprit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the elephant in the room is that there's a corrupt group that doesn't want probably peace to exist, that would have used, I'm sure, some of those resources for attacks into Israel.
So why don't
I
you
don't think
blame
it's
Hamas as
trivial
the
to say. I don't think it's trivial to say that there was no reason for the blockade. Whether it's justifiable will come down to your priorities. But I think to say that the blockade wasn't impactful, certainly into Gazans' lives, I think is probably inarguable that it's impactful.
why do you think as
I
Donnie says
don't
that
I
Hamas
think that
I mean,
I think that you're kind of building, you know, to build a stable society, you have to start with kind of a house of cards. You need peace, and you need justice, and you need resources. I think some kind of resolution to Palestinian statehood, some kind of either drastic change in the character of Hamas or removal of Hamas from being the governing body was necessary, and the Palestinians um, needed to have resources that people did want to give to them and couldn't be given to them, and even we're talking about fishing out to a certain line. I think all those ingredients need to be there. I'm not unpractical that I think you can simply, at the point that the walls have been built and the hatred has been pent up, I don't think you can simply remove the walls and the hatred disappears. I think it takes work. It doesn't mean that I don't think the walls are a problem. It doesn't mean that I think that work shouldn't be done, and it doesn't mean that I think that other things can be counterproductive to that work.
so
But I'm also not impractical that I think you can simply remove those walls and everything falls into place.
but Hamas, you would say, is not the primary culprit to Palestinian suffering in Gaza because you said that ultimately Palestinians need resources, and what's blocking the resources is the blockade. Therefore, the blockade is the primary source of suffering. So, Donnie, why don't you agree with that? Why do you think that Hamas, not the blockade, is the primary cause of Palestinian suffering in Gaza, or has been?
Because Israel has no interest in seeing Gaza be a depressed strip of territory. Like a flourishing Gaza is very good for Israel's interests. Yet they vastly kind of overvalue, or they vastly value their security over any, like giving that, even like they would rather the status quo with like with 5% better security than like 5% less security and a 50% shot of actually having happy Palestinians. So I think everyone's playing by their incentives. And yet to get off that merry-go-round, I do think Hamas has all the optionality in the world to just kind of liberalize or de-radicalize or whatever. And organizations don't typically do that, but I do think you have to give them that agency to do that. I think if we kind of taking, now I'm arguing against myself, but one could make the strong argument that it needs to be grassroots, and to do that, you need to have a certain amount of economic stability amongst the populace. So, yeah, like that's why I'm now playing Sock's side of the argument, and that's where it comes down to kind of it's almost a conservative liberal divide. It's like, are you going to expect? Are you going to say no? The onus is on you, no matter how much you are suffering. I'm still going to blame you for your suffering, and you have to fix it yourself. Or are you going to say no? This group of people has power. This group doesn't. The people with power, the onus is on them to help the people who don't have power, and they're actively taking away power from the disenfranchised group. And I mean, everything I just said, you can transplant onto the socioeconomics of the United States wealth inequality, right? Like it's sort of minus the violence part. That's what it is, So
I think it's a fair analysis. Would you agree with that, Socrates?
Yeah,
That
yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think
except you
I
wouldn't
think
agree with it. Donnie said that Israel wants a flourishing Palestine. Would you agree with that?
I want a flourishing Gaza Strip.
mhm.
Donnie said that Israel wants a flourishing Gaza Strip. Would you agree with that?
I think again it's complicated. I think there are, so if Hamas overnight became a relatively liberal, laissez-faire, whatever group that didn't have interests in rebellion against Israel and was simply concerned with effectively governing Gaza, and was in fact trying to quell radical sentiment of citizens within Gaza, then there's a lot of, whatever that pie of sentiment within Israeli society, Israeli government, everything. I think there's obviously a lot of parts of that would be very pleased, because, okay, well, this is one threat to our citizens, to our society, that's decreasing. Obviously, there would be a lot of aspects of that would be very pleased. And there's even, not to discount the people who are within Israeli society, Israeli government, who simply just do want at a human level to be neighbors with Palestinians, who, not to discount the humanity of Israelis, that they, would like to not have that at each other's throats relationship with people that they live, really just a few kilometers away from, and are, at a governmental and personal level interacting with, because there are Gazans who are going into Israel to work. I mean,
Yeah.
so it's not like these are even 100% separate societies. And at the same time, there are people like Bezalel Smotrich, who was convicted in Israel of terrorism before making his way to one of Netanyahu's top people, who want to see the Gaza Strip cleansed and want to see the ancient sites that have Jewish artifacts, and holy sites reclaimed, with Jewish settlers. I mean, those both exist within Israeli society and government. Um, I don't think at that level I can parse, you know, who wants what more. I think those both exist is probably as granular as I can say with my level of knowledge
So
about that
if you
society and
agree with
government.
if given how much of what Donnie says you agree with, why don't you also consider yourself a Zionist or aspire to be a Zionist
Um, aspire to be Zionist.
or be a
uh,
Zionist? Why are you not a Zionist? Yeah, if you agree with everything he says.
mhm. Um, I mean, again, this is just getting into definitions and terms. I mean,
So you're a
so
Zionist. So you're a Zionist. It's just terms, right?
it's all just sounds made with our vocal
Just
cords, my
take a
friend.
stand.
No, so I'm so let me define some of those edges of what that would mean for me.
And then
So,
probably you should wrap up. I mean, but
okay.
I guess if so, you agree with everything Donnie says. So he's a Zionist. Why are you not a Zionist? There's the question.
No, so I'm not someone who thinks that the state of Israel should be dismantled. Um, I think that the state of Israel should be reformed. Um, I believe, like many, I had a Israeli friend that I talked to, who I asked him about. There's this sentiment that criticism of Israel or the Israeli government is by definition anti-Semitic, and he'd actually never heard that before, and he said, "Okay, no, that makes you Israeli. We love to criticize our government." Um, so I think that the state of Israel has a right to exist. It's a recognized nation. I, at a basic level, am happy that there could be a Jewish state. I, I'm not happy that Jewish people create a state and act in a way that I find abhorrent. I think that the idea
What is
that
abhorrent? What's abhorrent?
um, it's impossible to attend a Seder, to think about running a Seder, and think about, when we were slaves in Egypt, God freed us. What does this mean today? And not think about the Palestinians. It's impossible to not think about it like that. And the idea that I think we were saying, in terms of the different sides that that me and Danny come from on this, there's a level of action that you could say is maybe consistent with the way of a lot of states behave, and there's, maybe this is my more lefty side coming out in terms of how I view, how states should behave, and I would personally say that Israel is behaving in a way that is worse than many states and many Western states. But even if it weren't, then I would say that my personal standards as a Jew for how Israel should behave have to be so much higher than that. That it wouldn't be enough to say, well, lots of states behave in a way that maybe isn't so justifiable, but is quite common. That's good enough. I would say, I'm not happy about, oh, finally our nomadship in the world has ended. We're not going to be abused by different states in which we're strangers. We're going to abuse strangers within our own state, or people who are non-citizens who are within our control. That makes me more sad than happy. I'm more saddened by the fact that a Jewish state is behaving this way than I am happy that there is a Jewish state, or that there is, this potential safe place for Jews who are experiencing hardship other places to potentially, have citizenship with.
Yeah.
That's where I come out on that on balance, and I think
And
that probably accounts for a lot of our difference in overall perspective. But I won't put words in your mouth.
by the way, is what they're doing in Gaza self-defense, Socrates?
Is what
Is
Israel
what
is
Israel
doing?
is doing in Gaza self-defense? Is it self-defense?
For a one word answer, no.
Okay. Yeah. Why not? So, but Donnie thinks it is. You think it's not. What's the difference there? You think what they're doing is horrible. Donnie thinks it's in self-defense. What's the crux of the difference in that view?
I think for something to be self-defense, it has to be the minimal level of force to protect yourself and your family, which in this case is the citizens of Israel. If
Donnie, do you agree or disagree?
Wait. Let me make one analogy for this, which is that.
And then I think Donnie has to run in a couple minutes.
I'll make it very brief. If a group of people, if you live down the street from a group of people, and that group of people attacks some people, or your family, let's say, to say we need to make it so that this group of people can never harm us again, we need to destroy their capacity to harm us, I believe goes beyond the minimal level of force to be considered self-defense.
Donnie, why do you disagree? Why do you think it's self-defense?
Unfortunately, I don't I don't have a strong, I think it was self-defense in the beginning when the rockets were coming. I think at a certain point it stops to be self-defense and you're conducting strategic goals. Their goal is to replace Hamas as the ruling power in Gaza. It's not really, you could say it's self-defense in the sense that Hamas has sworn to destroy Israel, but it's getting kind of far out. Do they have that capability? I don't know. Was it self-defense when the US went into Afghanistan to get rid of Osama bin Laden? Maybe, I don't know, but I don't care so much. It goes back to this is what Western nations do.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, this was fun. Or maybe fun's the wrong word. It's such a depressing topic, but it was really nice to just exchange ideas, viewpoints, hear where you're coming from, Sock.
I think I ended up being
really
as abrasive
to talk over you, Jake. I really appreciated the conversation, despite Jake's best efforts to get each other a little bit at each other's throats.
I
Yeah.
perfectly exemplified that abrasive YouTube guy that you sent me beforehand, like to a T. I am okay, guys. This is fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
To be continued, maybe.
All right.
Alright.
Cool.
Thank
Actually, maybe
you.
off the recording though, but
So
so now I'm gonna use
end this. Let me
yeah
end this.
stop the